Hello, everybody. This talk is part of the Climate Match 2023 course, Computational Tools for Climate Science. I am Verónica Gómez Tomás. I'm an Argentinian lawyer in international environmental law, and I will be your host for this conversation about climate justice. Climate justice is a term used for framing global warming as an ethical and political issue rather than one that is purely environmental or physical in nature. It relates the effects of climate change to concepts of justice, particularly environmental justice and social justice, and it examines issues such as equality, human rights, collective rights, and the historical responsibilities for climate change. The last IPCC report shows an increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme weather and climate events. Human rights are violated by climate change, and several court cases have recognized the legal link between climate change and these rights. But despite the global threat of climate change, international law doesn't provide effective responses to this global challenge. The Paris Agreement was adopted at COP21 as an international legal and political keystone of the collective efforts that were to be deployed in order to limit global warming at a level that would allow humanity to cope with dangerous consequences of climate change. Actually, it contemplates an ambitious temperature goal, not to go beyond 2 Celsius degrees, but still no greenhouse gas reduction targets. So in the face of the slow politics of climate change delaying climate change mitigation, many civil society actors, such as activists, NGOs, think tanks, lawyers, and social movements, have increased their efforts and go to court from different jurisdictions in order to put companies and government action on trial. All of them are demanding accountability for what they see as an urgent obligation on the part of the public authorities. Jose Rodriguez from World Youth for Climate Justice is here with us in order to clarify some topics about these issues. Welcome, Jose, and thank you for being here at Climate Match Academy.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and thank you everyone at Climate Match Academy for having me.
Well, I will introduce you. Jose Daniel Rodriguez Orue is a Costa Rican lawyer with a background in international human rights law. He has conducted legal research on the international standards applicable to human rights violation arising for climate change. He has a degree in law with a focus on environmental law from the University of Costa Rica and worked for 5 years as a legal assistant for the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. He currently serves as front convener for Latin America for the World Youth for Climate Justice and as an independent human rights consultant. Jose, please, could you explain us the intersection of human rights and climate change?
Of course, I think a good way to start to answer this question is having in mind that climate change is a phenomenon that widens, deepens existing inequalities, both within states and between states. And therefore, this means that first, not all states and peoples will be affected in a way that is proportionate to the contribution to climate change as a problem, but also that those that have contributed the least will be the most affected by climate change. So a person born in a developed country will not face the same impacts as a person born in a developing nation, for instance. And within countries, we talk about a lack of equity within generations and within peoples. And what climate change comes to do is to deepen those inequalities that have been historically placed upon different types of people on the basis of gender, race, and this means that climate change must be addressed under a human rights focus. What do I mean by this? For example, it's important to take into account that gender, for example, and ethnicity can intersect in a person. For example, an indigenous girl will not be impacted in the same way as a girl that is born in a city, but it's important to take into account that women would be disproportionately affected by climate change because of gender norms that have been socially imposed to girls. For example, in Africa, when there are droughts, women and girls are the main ones in charge of collecting water. And this exposes them to a heightened risk of violence, for example, but also takes young girls away from education. And this widens, as a systemic issue, the inequalities between genders. But of course, climate change will disproportionately affect different peoples on the basis of geography itself. For example, coastal communities will face profound impacts on their livelihoods because of the increase of sea levels, the sea level rises. And for example, island communities will face an even higher threat because many of their territories will actually cease to exist. Of course, those who will be most affected by climate change will be those living in poverty, because they will have the least tools that are needed, first to relocate if it's needed to a safer place, but also to adapt to the different effects of climate change. So first, states must take into account that climate change does not impact different people in the same way. And this means that states have to take positive measures to ensure that those inequalities are addressed in how climate change impacts different people. But also they have to keep this in mind when they develop public policy, because then the public policy that is designed to tackle climate change might have an unwanted discriminatory effect as well, harming human rights. For example, you may think of hydroelectric power plants as a good way to generate energy in a way that does not generate greenhouse gas emissions. But for example, if these hydropower plants are put into indigenous territories without taking into account the views and opinions and needs of indigenous populations, this measure that is in theory positive and can fight climate change will produce a discriminatory effect and thus a human rights violation. So this is why it's important for states to take into account that climate change is a human rights issue, and therefore human rights measures must be put into place.
Could you elaborate on how these movements are reshaping the legal landscape concerning climate change?
These sort of movements have come into place because of the lack of effectiveness of global climate change law, and therefore youth movements and civil society organizations have taken upon themselves to go to court. And what the youth argued was that not stopping deforestation was in turn affecting the state's possibility to mitigate the emissions of CO2 gas. And this would affect the enjoyment of the rights of future generations. And therefore, the Supreme Court of Colombia decided that the youth had a compelling argument, and that in fact, the state had to address deforestation in the Amazon forest as an obligation that stemmed from climate change treaties. This is fascinating because if you look at the Paris Agreement, if you look at the UN Framework Convention, they don't say much about deforestation or specific measures that states have to put into place in cases like this, but the domestic court interpreted that this, in fact, implied a state to take a proactive action in order to stop something that would harm the rights of future generations. There's a similar case it's called the Neubayer case in Germany, where youth said that Germany's greenhouse gas emission reduction percentage, which they had projected at 55% towards 2030, was not ambitious enough. And the German Constitutional Court resolved that, in fact, Germany was not doing all it could with all its possible resources. And this implied that its ambition in reducing greenhouse gas emissions would in the future become a discriminatory restriction on the rights of future generations. Because when the direst effects of climate change are going to become a reality in the future, they will undoubtedly have bigger restrictions on their rights. For example, they would have to pay more taxes so that the state has a best response to the effects of climate change. And so the German Constitutional Court said, Germany, you're not doing enough. You have to cut your greenhouse gases by at least 70% to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. But the truth is, the most current science says that we have to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. We have less than a decade to go, and states are not doing what is needed for that to be accomplished. And this is why, as a global youth movement, the World Youth for Climate Justice, we've been behind the civil society and youth campaign to take climate change to the International Court of Justice, supporting the call of Vanuatu and other Pacific Island states to ask the International Court of Justice an advisory opinion on climate change. Yes, well, this initiative, it has a previous attempt by Palau and the Marshall Islands. These initiatives have always been put forth by small island states because, as I mentioned earlier, they faced a very real threat to their territorial integrity. Most of them are projected to disappear, most of those territories in the coming years due to the effects of climate change. And therefore, in 2011, Palau and the Marshall Islands were gonna ask 2 questions on international responsibility to the ICJ, but this effort was fought against very hardly by developed states, because they thought this could bring discussions forward that could stimulate litigation against these states. So very strategically, a group of 27 Pacific Island students from the University of South Pacific in Vanuatu, they looked for all the legal avenues possible to make sure that their own fight for climate change, the effects that they were going to experience from climate change, were adequately addressed by the international community. And therefore, they looked at the Palau attempt and they said that, okay, we have to frame this in a different way as a human rights issue. And they took it to the government of Vanuatu. They had a meeting with representatives from the government of Vanuatu, and they sort of bought this idea, and then they took it forward to the Forum of the Pacific Islands, where 18 heads of states of the Pacific community also supported this initiative to request an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice. In parallel, the Pacific Island students fighting for climate change formed this global network of youth that's called the World Youth for Climate Justice at COP25, with different youth activists from Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America. I personally got involved when I was doing my graduate thesis on law. I was actually researching how states could become liable for not doing enough to fight climate change. And also my little brother, he's 3 now, had just been born, and that gave me like an urge to do something, you know, with all this legal knowledge that I was getting. And I saw they had like an open call for anyone that wanted to join the movement. I wrote to them, and thankfully I got accepted to the organization. And for the past 9 months, I've been leading the Latin American front of the organization, where we've talked with states and youth representatives and civil society organizations to make this a reality. And so the 29th of March, for first time in history, these 2 questions were presented to the International Court of Justice. For the first time by consensus, a resolution requesting an advisory opinion was adopted. And so this means that no state opposed that request. And that sends a strong message to the UN court that these questions have a lot of legal and political weight and that they require urgent answers. And so the resolution is asking 2 questions. One, what are the obligations of states to protect the climate system and other parts of the environment for the benefit of states and present and future generations? And the second question asks, what are the legal consequences when states do not comply with these obligations, and how that causes damage to states and to different people and groups of people. And so we're looking and hoping that this advisory opinion will provide legal clarity on what what states must do to comply with human rights obligations in the face of climate change. But it also relates to another advisory request that is currently ongoing before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. It was requested by Chile and Colombia, and it is solely focused on human rights obligations. And so we're also looking as a youth movement to influence that other advisory opinion and hopefully get 2 different advisory opinions that in unison tell states that they have to do more to face climate change as a human rights issue.
As you can see, climate justice is a scientific, political, socioeconomic, and legal challenge. And climate justice is emerging and growing phenomenon facing many legal gaps and political challenges. Here, civil society has all the cards in hand to contribute its grain of sand to make climate justice evolve. And the youth is a big part of this power of the civil society. So I strongly encourage you to get involved in such movements and to communicate about it and to raise awareness about climate justice. With us, Jose, and all the people watching us.
Thank you so much.